Hi, everyone. Good morning. If you're joining, we'll just let people filter into the webinar. Hi again, everyone. It's 11 a.m. In Vancouver. So happy to kind of get started as our attendee numbers are joining and welcome you. Welcome you on this July morning. Appreciate you taking the time to come to the information session. This is an information session on the Insurer Code of Market Conduct of British Columbia. Happy to provide you with some context about the Insurer Code that we've recently launched. So as we have the attendees climb, let's move to our next slide so that we can gather ourselves and also get started on our agenda. So with that, I really need to take a moment here to acknowledge that our organization is headquartered on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I personally am joining you from the nations of the Songhees, Esquimalt, nations in Victoria. So let's take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories that you reside on across the country. Thank you for that. And with that, we'll move to our next slide and I'll introduce the speakers here today. So myself, I'm Saskia Tolsma. As I indicated, I'm the Vice President of Policy and Stakeholder Engagement at BCFSA. I lead the overall coordination of BCFSA's regulatory agenda right across our regulated segments. Joining us here today and the prime speakers on the file are Marina Maknach, who is the Director of Market Conduct Financial Institutions, and also Lucas Neukveld, who is a Senior Policy Advisor who's been quite instrumental on this file. So we're going to run you through a short agenda, an information session, and both Marina and Lucas will speak to you in turn. So with that, Christina, if you don't mind just moving to the next slide. So our purpose here today is this is an information session. We're looking to outline what the Insurer Code of Market Conduct in BC is about, the requirements that it entails, and really how we've landed at this place today, and sketch out for you that trajectory. It is an information session, primarily with that purpose of building awareness. It's also to introduce you to Marina Maknach, who is your primary contact on this file. So as you have specific questions related to your business, related to your company, she is the appropriate point of contact and will be able to address any of those specific questions individually. So in that sense, really, we're holding this as an information session and won't be doing individual Q&As at this session, but really encourage you to reach out to Marina. Before I turn it over to Marina, kind of the overall trajectory that we've been on as an organization is that in BC, which is a unique requirement in Canada, we have a legislated obligation to bring forward an Insurer Code of Conduct, which is equivalent to a legislative instrument in British Columbia. And this has really set us forth on this trajectory, and where we have landed has been a place whereby we've had three main objectives in this project, and we think our ultimate landing zone achieves those objectives in turn. And the first objective is certainly ensuring the fair treatment of consumers, a primary objective for such a project of an Insurer Code of Market Conduct. The second objective has been based on the reality that we have a unique legislative environment in British Columbia and a unique legislative requirement that any such code needs to be practical for BCFSA to administer and enforce, and respective authorities that we have are reflected in that code. And then thirdly, and important to you and to all of the feedback we've received in the consultation process, acknowledging that British Columbia is one among many provincial regulators, and many of our insurance companies are operating in a national environment, and we need to be cognizant of that environment and working to align our approach with other provincial regulators in the market conduct space. So those were our three objectives that we set out with this project. It has been a project of kind of more of a year and a half in the making, and really a lot of great feedback has been received from industry. So appreciate your organizations and industry associations taking the time to participate in the consultation. We've received excellent feedback that I think has really informed where we have been able to land with the Insurer Code of Conduct in British Columbia and its alignment ultimately with the fair treatment of customers guidance from the Canadian Council of Insurance Regulators. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Marina, who is going to walk you through this in a more detailed fashion. And then she'll be turning it over to Lucas, who is going to be going through some of the Q&A that we have received through this process that we've received to date. So that will be an informative piece, and then we'll return for a short closing. So with that, happy to turn it over to you, Marina.
Thanks, Saskia. I'll start by way of providing a bit of a background. So in fall 2019, the BC government introduced a series of amendments aimed at modernizing the BC-FSA approach to how we supervise and oversee the market conduct of financial institutions. And these amendments were based on extensive consultation that took place between 2015 and 2018. One of the amendments was a new provision that required BC credit unions and insurers authorized to conduct business in BC to adopt and follow a market code of conduct. Next slide, please. When we talk about the insurance sector specifically, section 94.1 of the Financial Institution Act requires insurers first to adopt the code as established by BC-FSA and then comply with the code. The code includes fair treatment of customer principles, and the purpose of the code is to ensure that customers are protected from unfair treatment. Next slide, please. As you know, we went through a consultation process last year on our proposed approach to the code, and later on I will speak in a little bit more details about what we've heard from you. But in total, the consultation period and some follow-up questions from us lasted from the end of June last year to end of November 2022, and then we took some time to walk through the feedback, and in May 2023 we met with industry associations and presented our code and explained how we arrived at our approach. On July 10th, each of you received a regulatory statement with a code as well as a summary of consultation comments. And all insurers companies, all insurers are now in a process of implementing the code up until April 1st, 2024, when the industry should be in compliance with the code. Next slide, please. If we talk about the code itself, the key points to note here are we used 12 expected outcomes from the CCI Fair Treatment of Customer Guidance as the code's principles. And this approach was in response to the industry comments and government's desire to align the requirements in BC with the national guidance. The BC-FSA code is principles-based, and it focuses on what insurers only, not intermediaries, are required to adhere to at the principle level. Now, because it's a principle-based code, it provides latitude to insurers to implement principles in a flexible manner. But the overarching principle that's stated in the CCI Fair Treatment of Customer Guidance remains the same in our code. It's the insurer that's responsible for fair treatment of customers throughout the life cycle of the product. The code does not include any additional BC-specific principles. There is no supplemental guidance to the code that we are releasing at this time. And do have the ability to amend the code in the future, and we could develop any additional guidance to the code if we see a need to do so. Next slide, please. I have a couple of slides here that list 12 principles included in the code, and I hope you've seen it in the regulatory statement and the code that we released just 10 days ago. I don't want to read each of the principle. As I said, I hope you're familiar with this, but the point to highlight here for you is these principles are the outcomes from the CCI Fair Treatment of Customer Guidance. And if you're trying to find them in that guidance, look for the sentences included in the boxes at the top of the page throughout the CCR guidance. The only changes to the wording in our code that we made was when we removed a reference to the intermediaries. Everything else stayed the same as in CCI FTC guidance. Next slide, please. So we talked about the code at a high level, but let's spend a minute or so on the consultation process that we had in 2022 and what we've heard from you. As previously mentioned, in June 2022, we launched the consultation on the code, and at that time, we consulted with the industry on 2 documents. One was the BCFSA code, and one was the supplemental guidance to the code. The proposed code at that time had 20 principles, including 3 principles that were specific to British Columbia. One was on incentives management, one was on online sales, and one was on policy decisions and renewals. So that was the code. We also consulted on the supplemental guidance. That document provided examples of the expectation an insurer could implement as they were setting or updating their own policies and procedures in order to be compliant with BCFSA Code of Market Conduct. The feedback that we received from the industry was mostly related to the supplemental guidance, not the code itself. And in general, what we've heard from you is that the industry understands the move towards a principle-based regulation. The industry appreciates the flexibility that a principle-based code provides. But the industry wants BCFSA to adopt the CCI FTC guidance as a wholesale. And it does not want any additional principles or any province-specific modifications. And the justification for this was to avoid any inconsistency with other jurisdictions and potentially increased administrative burden. Next slide, please. So we took the time and we considered your feedback very carefully. BC government, in its review of the Financial Institution Act, stated a desire for BCFSA to develop a code of conduct for insurers that would be consistent with international standards. And then the government also stated that ideally CCR would develop a national code of conduct for insurers that BCFSA could adopt. Now, as you know, CCR opted not to develop a national code, and instead in 2018, it developed a joint CCR Fair Treatment of Customer guidance document. Because the Financial Institution Act explicitly stated BCFSA has to develop the code, we couldn't simply adopt the FTC guidance. And the reasons for that included: first, the guidance is not structured as a code. Second, it includes expectations that apply not only to insurers, but intermediaries, which would complicate the adoption of the code. And then adopting the FTC guidance wholesale would mean that insurers operating in BC would be legally required to follow all of the detailed expectations in the FTC guidance, and In our view, it's overly prescriptive and quite problematic from an operational perspective. So based on this, it wasn't possible for us to adapt and enforce the CCI FTC guidance. And we had no choice but to develop our own code of market conduct for British Columbia. Having said that, harmonization was a key consideration for us to ensure that we are as consistent as possible with other jurisdictions and the CCI FTC guidance. And with that in mind, we concluded that the best approach for BCFSA was to draw the code's principles from the FTC guidance. Now, if you go to the next slide, let's spend a couple of minutes on the supervisory approach. The compliance with the BC Market Code of Conduct is embedded in the legislation, and BCFSA will be assessing insurers' compliance with the code. The data that might trigger our examinations remains the same, and it could include what you report in annual statements on market conduct, the complaints data we receive, any information that comes from CCI and any other regulators, as well as any other data points that we collect and then we analyze. When we conduct market conduct examination, we use a number of resources to determine the examination's criteria in order to assess your processes and practices. And our examination criteria could come from, for example, expectations included in CCI fair treatment of customer guidance, expectations that are included in any other supplemental CCI guidance, such as incentives management guidance. We could also draw our examination criteria from any additional guidance that are unique to BC that we have established. And an example here could be claims and complaints management guidance that we developed and published last year. And we might also develop additional guidance if, based on our examinations and investigation in market conduct department, we consider that the supplemental guidance on adherence to the code is required. Having said that, it's always our intention to ensure that our expectations and recommendations are reasonable, proportionate. It reflects the size and complexity of your operation. Next slide, please. So what about non-compliance? Non-compliance with the code might result in a number of actions on our side, including a letter of expectations, voluntary compliance agreement, cease order, penalty, and any other actions that we consider appropriate. We do recommend insurers to be proactive and self-assess their own processes and practices in order to identify potential weaknesses. And a few resources that are publicly available that insurers could use to help with the self-assessment piece include, for example, any of the CCR publications, such as consolidated examination reports that are a result of cooperative supervisory activities conducted by a few jurisdictions under the CCR umbrella. When we conduct our own thematic examinations of a few insurers under a specific topic, we typically don't publish individual examination reports in BCFSA, but we do try to publish consolidated examination reports that identify common gaps that we note in your processes and practices. And we supplement it by a guidance that states BCFSA expectations related to those gaps. And as I just mentioned, an example of such a report is claims and complaints management guidance that we published last year. It draws on the gaps that we identified when we reviewed a few of the home warranty providers over the last few years, and it also states our expectations related to claims and complaints. So these reports are very useful, a good source of information for insurers to conduct their own self-assessment. Another good source of information for self-assessment are BCFSA voluntary compliance agreements and undertakings related to market conduct of financial institutions. And we publish these documents on our website. These documents also speak to the gaps that we find in insurers' processes and practices. Now, to conclude, I would like to say that at the end of the day, what BCFSA and other regulators want to see is insurers coming to the terms with the breadth and extent of market conduct impact. We want to see market conduct consideration taking place at every level of management, operation, distribution, and customer. And the questions that we want management proactively asking themselves about market conduct of their financial institution, for example, include, do we have a view of our top 10 market conduct risks? What proactive steps do we have in place in order to ensure that we are identifying and responding to market conduct risks prior to risk surfacing? Are we confident that we are looking at appropriate data from across the whole financial institution to inform our conduct risk management? Have our efforts to identify market conduct risk to date identified any gaps? Have we implemented activities to close those gaps? Or how do we ensure that across our financial institution, our staff understands that they have a responsibility for managing the conduct risk and what we have done to enable our staff to improve the conduct of their business or their function? We want to see insurers thinking about market conduct as part of their culture rather than simply a compliance exercise with some of our expectations. So the focus should be on fair treatment of customers' outcomes rather than prescriptive elements. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lucas to go through some of the question and answers. Over to you, Lucas.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. So if we'll jump to the next slide, we'll start with the first question, which is ultimately about what it means to adopt and comply with the Code of Market Conduct. This is really going to build on a lot of the stuff Marina just spoke to, respecting the supervisory approach. So there's two parts to this. The first part is about that adoption. So we expect all insurers authorized to do insurance business in BC to adopt the code through whatever process their organization has in place by April 1st, 2024. So no prescriptive process. At this time, we're not requiring an attestation from each insurer confirming that they have adopted the code. Moving to the compliance component, it's an ongoing obligation, which means effectively implementing policies and procedures that support each of the 12 principles in the code, and then governing and overseeing compliance and adherence to those FTC principles. It's really the role of the board and senior management, in our view, to ensure the organization as a whole adheres to sound business practices and to ensure the fair treatment of customers throughout the product lifecycle. This focus in this should be on two things. First, preventing the insurer from delivering poor or unfair outcomes for the customers. And secondly, minimizing those market conduct risks to customers and the risk that they will be harmed by insurers' practices or activities or by unacceptable standards of business conduct. One thing to point out, which is both reflected in our code and CCR's FTC guidance, is that the insurer is responsible for complying with the code even when the insurer uses one or more third parties to provide services. We can move to the next question. So I'll jump right to the answer for this question because it's really just, it's kind of a key message from today. So if you can go to the next section. If for any reason you cannot meet the April 1st, 2024 deadline for adoption and compliance with the code, please reach out to Marina and her team to discuss and to figure out the reasons, a path forward. Jump to the next question, please. How will BCFSA ensure alignment in its FTC expectations with other regulators, so with other provinces? Move to the next question. CCIR's FTC guidance brings that level of consistency and expectations as it relates to each of the principles included in our code. So again, the code takes those outcomes from the FTC guidance and puts them forth as principles. So when we examine insurers against the expectations in the FTC guidance and with the other guidance documents that Marina referred to, we either conduct standalone examination of insurers' policies and procedures, or we conduct a joint examination through CCIR's cooperative supervisory activities, which involves reviewing an insurer across multiple jurisdictions. In either case, what we want to emphasize is that we engage with peer regulators and with our colleagues in other provinces to discuss our findings and recommendations, ensuring we're aligned in terms of identified weaknesses and the application and or interpretation of those fair treatment of customers principles that led to each of the recommendations in the reports. Moving to the final question here, what happens if BCFSA, what happens to the BCFSA code if CCIR updates or adds to its FTC guidance? Moving to the answer. So in the legislation, we have the authority to update the code from time to time if we see a need to do so. However, changes to the code would be driven by either a requirement for national consistency, so in other words, to ensure we continue to be aligned with the CCIR FTC guidance, or by BC specific needs as issues arise. In either case, we'll actively engage with industry to decide on how updates to the code are handled and addressed. And one thing to just a point that was made earlier, there's a link in the presentation to the code itself, just noting that there should be a link to the code in the meeting invite embedded in the advisory that was put out with the meeting invite, so you can find the code there. It's also available in the regulatory statement as well as on our website if you're looking to see what those principles are. And I will pass it back to Saskia to close us off.
Thanks, Lucas. So as we kind of emphasized at the start, Marina Machnach is really your primary point of contact within our organization. If and when you would like to discuss the code in more detail, if you have questions with respect to its implementation, with respect to our supervisory approach, Marina is available, and we will kind of continue to refine our supervisory approach based on the questions and the engagement going forward. So encourage you to reach out if you need to. There was also a question directed at us about whether this presentation and webinar are being recorded. They are, and they will be available on our website as well. So appreciate we are doing this kind of end of July. So particularly for those of you who have colleagues who are on vacation, happy for you to share that resource with them as well. And it will live on our website as in an evergreen fashion. And then if you don't mind, Christina, one final slide, just to also draw your attention to another consultation that we have underway that has implications on the insurance side as well. Yesterday, we released BCFSA's proposed approach with respect to managing natural catastrophes and climate-related risk. This is a sector-wide proposed approach that we are thinking about in British Columbia, so with respective implications right across our regulated segments, including insurance companies in BC and extra provincial insurance companies in British Columbia. So welcome you to take a look and also provide your feedback. That consultation is open until the fall. And so with that, happy to wrap things up. And really, again, appreciate you joining us this morning and also being able to make the connection with Marina, who's able to touch base with you with any of your respective queries or comments. So many thanks, and hope you're able to enjoy some summer weather and holidays with friends and family. Take care, everyone.